Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining once again. Without any further ado, I'm going to get into this. Today is all going to be all about the often pretty small decisions, design decisions that we make at the Financial Times, which really transform a chart into a piece of communication, a piece of data storytelling, as I was talking about last week. So that was last week was a theory. This week is going to be putting that into practice. Um, the getting through in some instances, I'm going to show you behind the scenes of how you would do this in Flourish. In others, I'm just going to show you the end results of each step along the way. But hopefully, there's a lot of really practical stuff here to show you what we mean when we talk about going from chart to communication. And yeah, I think the key message that will come out is that it's often really quite small changes that can have a big impact on a chart. But I think the one of the core themes from what I was talking about last week is how the process of getting the chart technically correct is one thing, but then going from a technically correct chart to something that really tells a story, really speaks to a much larger audience, is a completely separate task. And sometimes that second task requires a lot of work, but sometimes it's actually really quite small changes. So, to give you a perfect example of what I mean in terms of these changes and in terms of how a small change can have a big impact, I'm going to do the first live demo of the day. So please bear with me if anything, if there are any slight hitches, but hopefully there won't be. So I'm going to be talking about how to transform this chart into something that has a much deeper message. So this is a chart that I first made a couple of years ago now, looking at the different measures of the mental health of young people, teenagers, in fact, in the UK and the US over the last 30 or 40 years. And what we've got here is a chart where we've got standard line chart, time on the x-axis, and the y-axis is the combined depressive symptoms score, which is a medical terminology for a series of questions that people answer and whether there are signs that this person may have quite significant mental health difficulties. So we've got a standard chart here with different points and a line showing the smooth average. And, this chart is already telling us something quite striking. We're seeing that in the last 10 or 15 years, there's been this marked rise in young people with depression, anxiety, other mental health problems in the UK and the US. But that story is only potentially part of the picture. So I'm just going to flip across into Flourish to show you um, how we can significantly add to what that chart is saying simply by adding a tiny bit of text, a tiny annotation. So if I come in here to the annotation section and I say, right, on the x-axis, I want to highlight the range from 2010 to, say, 2023. And what do I want to say about that range? I want to say, well, it just so happens that this is the period through which we've had smartphones. So simple, a tiny little edit like that. And if I now flip back across here, this chart is now saying significantly more. So that is the tiniest little tweak, just saying here's an additional bit of contextual information that tells you what's happening over this period. It tells you that this deterioration in young people's mental health coincided with the period where smartphones became ubiquitous. Everyone had them in their pocket, or more to the point, often out of their pocket. Um, and you suddenly get a much richer story. The fundamentals of the chart have not changed. The data has not changed, but by adding this little annotation, we really, really move the story forward. I would say though as well, I chose this example because it's an example of also how with great power comes great responsibility. When I actually produced this chart originally, there was a whole quite heated debate afterwards about whether this annotation was sort of saying too much almost, whether this was implying causation when the causal relationship between smartphones and mental health is still being figured out. There was a debate essentially as to whether this was potentially misleading. Now, I think I'm not going to rehash that whole debate here. I think that by adding context, saying here's something that was happening at the same time, there is not necessarily any causality applied. We're just saying, here's an additional bit of information that's useful to know. But again, not saying what was right or wrong, but it's an example of how there is this trade-off. Text is so powerful, whether it's in the title or annotations, but it also means that you're then saying a lot more, and you're getting further away from quote unquote just showing the data, even though, of course, the smartphone takeoff was indeed still data. So yeah, just an example of how tiny little change makes a much more impactful chart, but that comes with tension in terms of the discourse that it can create. So that I think just gives you a taste of what I'm talking about here. But there's a lot more we can talk about. So if I now flip through to the general idea of matching chart design to story. This is what I was talking about a lot last week. Some people might remember a few months ago, it was the German national election. And one of the stories that emerged from that election was about the difference in voting patterns among young people, young men and young women. Now, if I wanted to make a chart making that point, and I just threw the data straight into a template, I'd get something like this. So this is showing the percentage of young men and young women who voted for each party in the German election. But there's no the story here that we're interested in is not jumping out at all. There's a lot of information here, a lot of bright colors, but what should someone's takeaway be here? Well, the reason I talked about narrative titles last time is I think that a really good practice across the board is to always start by writing your chart title. What once you've done the analysis, what is the takeaway that someone should come away with? So if we do that, right, there was a wide gender gap in young Germans' voting patterns. That is useful. It's a good chart title, but it's also useful for us to now say, well, okay, I'm talking here about a gap, but where's the gap in this chart? My chart and my title don't really match up. The chart is, again, not incorrect, but how can I recraft this chart so it better tells the story of the title? And so in this instance, I take the same data and then we just go through and we've remixed this. I'm now, again, exactly the same data, but let's have that focus be on whether young men and young women voted differently for parties of the left and parties of the right. So I'm now grouping the parties into the Greens and the Linke, the left, and vote share for those parties. And then over to the right of my axis, I've got parties of the right, the AfD, Populist Right Wing Party, the Christian Conservative Party, and the economically liberal right-wing party FDP. So same data but remixed. I've also subtracted, if I look back, the parties that don't fit neatly into that left-right categorization and therefore aren't really part of this story. And you'll see I've also got that axis title across the top, really emphasizing what we're talking about here being the left and the right. So same data, but by first of all writing that title to guide ourselves as well as the readers, it clarifies the goal that we have with this chart, so we can then make those subtle changes to the data, subtle changes to the design, sorry, and we have something that tells that story much more powerfully. I guess the only other little touch that I've added with this chart is using the fact that we can add up the total numbers in each set of bars as a label. So we can see that 47% of young women voted for parties of the left versus 28 for the right. And among young men, it was almost exactly flipped. 49% voted for parties of the right, 26% parties of the left. So same chart, same broad chart layout, but a couple of tweaks, which I think just match up what the chart actually shows to the title clearly. So I'm now going to go on to the next example. The difference between whether we want to emphasize stocks or flows in a chart. Again, this is where we have exactly the same data, but by presenting it in a couple of different ways, you can tell subtly different stories.
Sorry, John.
Yes, I'm just going to
No,
put.
sorry to interrupt you. But somebody did ask a really good question, which is about the previous diverging bars chart. Yes, so they're asking, how did you center the bars or align them to the middle, which is speaking a little bit about the behind the scenes.
Sure, yeah. So what I've done here is I'm using a stacked bars template, but I've then got what I've done, which again, invisible here, but the data is structured such that I've done I've done the left wing parties as negative numbers and the right wing parties as positive numbers, which means the negative ones are plotted to the left the positive ones to the right. And then in the settings, what you can do is you can say display negative numbers without the negative sign. So whenever you want some diverging data like this, just do some numbers as negative values, some as positive values, but we can then say don't show the negative value, the negative sign, sorry.
Amazing. And just to bring it up that not only the slides will be shared, but also the charts that John is showing will be duplicable for anybody. So you're going to be able to explore each of these charts and even see the data behind them to understand how they're being made. So even if we cannot cover or answer all the questions being flagged today, you're going to be able to understand how this works. So over to you, John. Sorry to interrupt.
Great. No, fantastic. That's exactly what we want the Q&A to be dynamic like this. So yeah, that was the trick with that one, is to have the data as showing some values negative, some as positive, but then display those numbers as positive regardless. So stocks and flows, same data, different ways of showing it. This was some data from the US election last November, showing what's happened to the vote share for Democrats and Republicans in different parts of the country. So we can take this data and show it as stocks, i.e. the quantities. And the focus here is on, well, how red and how blue are these different types of area, from large metros, large cities, to the suburbs, to rural areas. And if we present the data like this as a stacked area, then we're really focusing on the quantities, the stocks, and the fact that US cities remain relatively blue, but in rural areas, Democrats are an ever-shrinking minority. That blue in rural areas is getting squeezed out. But we could take exactly the same data, package it differently, and end up with this chart where we're then focused on the flow. We're focused on that direction, that momentum. And this time it better emphasizes things like the fact that in the suburbs, this is now the core battleground in US elections, where the Democrats and Republicans are constantly, the lead is slightly changing hands. It's roughly 50-50. Whereas in rural areas, you've seen this sustained divergence with the Republicans gaining significant ground and Democrats losing ground. So that's exactly the same data, but just from switching to areas to lines, we change the story that we're telling. I'm now just going to come on to the next one, which is again a recent US political story. This time, what I wanted to look at was what's been happening to various economic indicators in the US since Donald Trump started making his announcements about tariffs, and how, crucially, is that different to what previous US economic turmoil has looked like. So we can take that data and throw it into a chart like this, where there's a fair amount going on here. So I'll just pause for a second while we talk about it. What we're saying here is quite a subtle economic point, or for those who are well versed in economics and markets, it's maybe not so subtle, but for those who aren't, it is. So the title here is important. What we're saying here is that usually when the US stock market suffers, that pain is cushioned by the fact that you have falling bond prices, which means lower interest rates, and a strengthening dollar, which means Americans can buy things for, well, American consumers, their goods, their purchases are cheaper. So usually when stocks, the green line goes down, that's helped by the fact that bonds come down and dollar goes up. Same in the COVID pandemic. Stocks took a hit, but bonds also went down and the dollar went up. So that was cushioning the impact. Whereas with Trump, we've actually seen the opposite. Stocks again go down, but this time the blue line for bonds has gone up, which means higher interest rates, and the red line for the dollar has gone down, which means things are more expensive. So there's a lot going on there, and you can see, the title is important, but you still got to look at quite a lot to see what it is that makes this period different to those previous periods. So something we can try here is to actually remix this same data, but instead of having the different periods in the different charts and the different metrics in the different lines, what if we flip those around? And now the Trump outlier quality maybe jumps out that bit more clearly. Now we're saying, right, what we usually see is bonds with the two blue lines go down, whereas with Trump they're going up. And with the dollar, the two blue lines for the past usually go up. With Trump, they're coming down. So exactly the same data, but we've just remixed. So this time you are having to identify the pattern that was common across the first two panels and then spot that the third one was different. Whereas we're making that comparison easier this time by saying all we're looking at here is, does the Trump line go in the same direction as the non-Trump lines? So a way of taking a relatively complex story, remixing the data slightly, and allowing that takeaway, the fact that the Trump period as an outlier to be a little bit clearer than in this previous one, where you've got to really focus on the chart to actually work out why this period is different to the previous one. The next one, and this is going to be my second live demo. This one's really interesting. So comes up from time to time. And I'll just let me open the first chart so we can talk about this. So this is a chart showing Donald Trump's approval rating, and I'll pause there for a second to say, fear not, there will be plenty of non-US politics charts in this presentation. But I just wanted to use some live and sort of current things that I've been working on recently. But again, this chart is showing Donald Trump's approval rating among the people who voted for him last November, which I've split into those who identify as MAGA, Make America Great Again, Republicans, and those who don't. But the point here is about what is the baseline when we plot data. Usually, I think we're used to the whole debate about having a y-axis start at 0. And the reason we usually do want the y-axis to start at 0 is because most data starts from 0. Data is growing. We're talking about counts of things. It makes sense. It helps for us to anchor ourselves in the data to start at 0. But when you're talking about the approval for a president that people had already voted for, that's not so clear. And I mean, to give another example before I come back to this, and this is the example I always bring up when someone says y-axis should always start at 0, is what if someone was showing a chart of the world's average temperature, the global average temperature for the last several thousand years? If you start that at 0, and then whether the chart is in Celsius or Fahrenheit or Kelvin, even, you would massively mask the impact of climate change by starting your y-axis at 0, when we actually care about the change relative to normal, not relative to 0. And using that same logic here, when we're talking about approval for Donald Trump among people who voted for Donald Trump, I would argue that the reference line, the baseline that we should use, is actually not 0, but 100. You would expect people who just voted for someone to strongly approve of that person. And the reason I'm talking about all this is that if we remix the chart with that in mind, we can actually much more powerfully and effectively show what we're talking about, which is this drop in support from 100%, instead of having all this dead space at the bottom towards 0. So if I flip back over to here and look at this example, here's what I did when I made this chart. So first of all, I'm saying, right, what we care about is not starting from 0, it's how close we are to 100. So the first thing we can do there is we reset the extent of our y-axis. But I'll pause here because there's a problem. Because we've got this hard, strong gray line across the bottom of the chart, there's a sort of implication here that that is still a hard bottom. The actual number there is 45%, but that's meaningless. It looks as though, for example, the chart showing approval of Trump on inflation, it looks as though that line is crashing down towards a hard baseline of 0, when actually there's nothing special about the number 45. So what we can do is we move that axis to the top, and this completes the job. It's a critical two-step. We're not just saying change the extent of the y-axis. We need to visually change the baseline, the anchor point that people are comparing those lines against in this chart. So now we're making it clear that the norm, the baseline, the reference line is about 100. And we're showing that rather than crashing towards a hard baseline of 0, or indeed a hard baseline of 45, the empty space at the bottom of the chart now shows that there's still room to fall. So we're making better use of the space. We're emphasizing that what matters here is falling away from 100, not falling towards 0. But crucially, we're making it clear that there's further to fall. There's not a hard baseline to be hit. And I'm just going to pause there in case there are any questions on this one. But if there aren't, then I will proceed to the next section, which again, for me, this is a super interesting one that we don't talk about enough in the field. So what if you're making a chart where time is actually vertical rather than horizontal? Now, you may be listening to me and thinking, well, why on earth would you do that? We have this decades-long, centuries-long convention that time runs from left to right. In most cultures, we read from left to right. It makes total sense. This is what everyone expects. But hear me out. Again, sorry, another US politics example, but I think you'll agree that this one is a good one to show what I mean. So here we have data showing the extent to which US politicians for the Democrats and the Republicans are left wing or right wing, how left wing or right wing the different politicians are based on some academic analysis. And of course, as soon as we start talking about the left and the right in politics, it becomes slightly odd that left and right on this chart are actually time, and top and bottom, up and down, are our political left and right. So there are two things here. I think that two things that can happen with a chart, which I think should lead us to start thinking about whether we want to rotate that axis. One is when, such as this, you have the left and the right not pointing left and right. We want to remove that disconnect and make this as intuitive as possible. The other is just anytime you've got a y-axis title, which is asking your readers, your viewers, your audience to tilt their head. Anytime you've got any text, in fact, that is asking someone to tilt their head, I think that is a clue to us that we want to be flipping the whole thing. So what we can do is we switch from that standard line chart template into a connected scatter plot template, which allows us to plot this in a much more intuitive way. Now we've got time proceeding upwards, we've got the left, indeed on the left, the right on the right, and it's also now just much easier to see that this headline, the title of the chart about Republicans moving further to the right than Democrats to the left, is really true in the data. Whereas beforehand, you would have to tilt your head on one side to read things, to actually see the core point of the chart. So that is the first thing we should do. But you may be looking at this now and thinking, well, who says time should run upwards? Who says we should have the oldest stuff at the bottom and the newest stuff at the top? What about plotting it like this? And this is a really interesting one because, as far as I'm aware, there actually isn't a clearly established convention on this point. My instinct, and when I've done this recently, has been to plot it like this because you're sort of saying people's attention is going to start at the top of the chart, as we knew from what we looked at last week. And so I want that most important information to be at the top, the most important being the newest information. So I've got that at the top. But someone can equally make the case that, well, when we read text, articles, books, we read from top to bottom. So why not lean into that human instinct and have time running from top to bottom? And to be honest, the jury, I think, is still out. And an interesting thing that some people might not know with this is even the fact that we used blue for the Democrats and red for the Republicans. That's something that's only happened in the last couple of decades when we talk about graphical conventions. As late as the 1990s, you often used to see charts and maps and materials in the US showing the Democrats in red and the Republicans in blue. So this question of whether time should run up or down, as far as I'm aware, is still an open question. But having said all that, my personal preference is still to go this way because it puts all the new, usually typically in a line chart, the point at the end is the most salient important one. And so I'm putting all of that in the viewer's sort of foreground when they first look at a chart. Another point here, I guess, is that people are so used to using social media feeds these days. And in those feeds or live blogs, news feeds, the newest information is always at the top. So again, you can argue both ways, but I think it's an interesting example and an interesting discourse. We'll see where this ends up. But I want to pause here because something you may have clocked in this chart, and indeed the downward facing one, is that we've lost our line labels. So back here we had the Democrats in blue, Republicans in red, but in the process of switching to a vertical connected scatter chart, we've lost those labels because that isn't natively supported. So time for another live demo. How do we add those labels or annotations back into a chart? And indeed, how do we freely annotate any chart? So I'm going to flip across again to here and give you a look at that. So here's the chart that we've just made. If anyone's interested in the data structure, I've got the years as a column, the values as a column, and the party as a column. This is long format data for those of you who understand that instead of the parties being columns. But if I now go in here and I say, right, I want to get labels back on these lines. If I tried to use the native functionality here, we would get the labels. If you bear with me a second, we would get the labels appearing on every point. Now, that's not what we want. We just want labels at the end. So what we do is we hit create a story based on this chart. And in this instance, I'm just going to turn off the captions because we don't actually want to create a story per se with this chart. We just want to use the ability to add annotations. So the first thing I always do when I'm doing this in Flourish is I give myself some more space to work with. I'm going to then hit the little annotation tool and I'm going to come over here and say, right, I want some text just about here saying Dem for Democrats. But to leverage the semantics of color, I don't just want that label to be black. I want this label to be blue like the Democrat label. So I'm going to come into here, I'm going to hit the text color, I'm going to hit the eyedropper tool, and I'm going to say, right, grab that same blue that we used for the arrow. But then here's another little trick. I want that text to be darker. I want to maximize the contrast between the color of the text and the background, so that it is as readable as possible. So I'm actually going to edit this color to make it slightly less bright. And there we have our Democrat label. Then I want to do the same thing for the Republicans. I'm going to come over to this side. I'm going to say, give me a annotation for the Republicans, place it there. Again, grab that red color from the line, but to make this as clearly legible as possible, make it a bit darker. You can see what I mean here, I think. If I just taken the actual color of the line as is, it's a fairly faint red. So all I'm doing is I'm saying reduce the lightness of that color, and there we have it. We now have our line labeled again. And I'll come back and show you an example of this in a minute where we're actually using that annotation tool even more. But the point is, I think it's really good to get to grips with the ability to place annotations freely anywhere on the chart. It's really good to always leverage the fact that we should then have them the same color as the data series, but also that little trick I showed you there to make the text darker than the actual underlying color in our color palette to make it as readable as possible. You can imagine if the line there was, for example, yellow or orange, we'd want to make sure that text is darker than the line to make it readable. Lots of research that I actually didn't go into last week consistently shows that. So your text, ideally, if you have this ability, your text should always be a slightly darker shade than the underlying line. And I will have a natural pause there in case we've got any questions before I go into the next little section. Cool. All right, the next one, oh,
Sorry.
Muffy, go for it.
Oh, sorry. It just always takes me 1 second. I think this one is interesting because we just showed stories. So again, I put it on the chat, but for anybody not aware of what stories are, they're just a way for us to stitch different Flourish charts together. And somebody's asking right now, do you find that switching to stories sooner rather than later? It's normally helpful when trying to make additions to the chart that are natively supported. So effectively, when should people should go to stories as opposed to exhausting one template?
That's a really good question. I find you want to do as much as possible before you go to stories, because the basics of your color palettes and the type of your chart and the extent of the x-axis and y-axis and the axis titles and everything, those are things you have to do in the visualization mode before going into the story. So generally, you want to get your chart, you get the sort of the scaffolding, as it were, of your chart as far along as possible and then nip into story mode. But of course, if while you're in story mode you realize, oh, there was something here that I need to go back and change in my axis, for example, you can easily do that and it will be automatically updated in the story. So yeah, I think it's both ways work. But I do find the more I use the free annotations, the more I value them. Like when I've done work using other tools or using my own D3 coded charts, the first functionality I added in my own tooling was the ability to freely annotate. I think I spent the whole of last week's session talking about the importance of text and annotations. And if I could only have text at the end of a line, that would be quite annoying, as we'll indeed see in a minute. So yeah, I think it's really good to get to grips with whatever tool you're using out there, just the ability to freely write text where it makes the most sense on your chart.
Amazing.
Great. So the next one, this is actually revisiting one of the charts we showed earlier, but just underscoring again the importance of narrative titles. So this is my chart again, looking at economics and finance in America under Donald Trump. And I'm showing you the chart I showed originally, but without that narrative title. So that the point again I'm trying to get across here is that even though to someone who looks at this data all day long and every day, it would make sense to them what's interesting about this chart. That is not going to be true for the vast majority of people out there who are not financial markets experts. So I don't know if this was even necessarily true to me before I really started reading more about this issue. So what we're doing with narrative titles and charts is not just leaning into the ability to say something powerful and engaging. It's actually allowing someone to even understand what they're meant to be looking at in this chart. Um, the technical elements of this chart are all here. There's nothing wrong with them. The data is all there. The colors are all fine. But where should someone's attention go on this chart? Without that title, it's unclear. But when we add that title, right, it's about the difference between what usually happens, which we see on the left in the middle, and what has happened this time around on the right. So just underscoring how the chart title is ticking many, many different jobs. It's not just about sort of amplifying our message. It's about actually making sure someone even understands what they should be looking at in the first place. It's essentially a guide. It's a guide to how to read this chart. And whenever someone doesn't have a narrative title, you're really missing that opportunity to hold someone's hand and help them understand what they're looking at. And if I now go on to more annotations work, I'm going to show you a couple of examples here. The first one is the ability to not just annotate a point in time, but to actually emphasize or de-emphasize different parts of a chart to draw out certain sections. So this is a remix of a chart that I made last year, which I've redone in a different style. This was at the time of the Olympics in Paris last year, looking at the impact of so-called super shoes. So athletes, for those who don't know, for those who aren't athletics nerds like me, athletes in the running events at the Olympics and indeed all other running events these days are all wearing these very, very fancy new shoes, which have things like carbon plates and super, super bouncy foam in them. And there's been this ongoing debate over the years about is this innovation in footwear? Is it really actually making anyone faster, or is it all marketing? And what this chart I think shows is that actually there has been this really big change in the last few years of the number of men and women breaking significant historical time barriers in various different running events has exploded. But again, all you're seeing here is the data. We're missing that crucial tie-up between the theory that this is somehow to do with these super shoes and what we're seeing in the data. Like, could there have been something else happening here? Is this something somehow to do with COVID, or could this even be to do with performance enhancing drugs or something? So, what I did with this chart was I went in and I said, let's show when the various different footwear for each event was introduced. And the point I'm emphasizing in this chart is I'm not just saying here's when the contextual change happened, but I'm actually brightening and fading out the two aspects of the chart to again just really emphasize the difference between the before and the after. And for anyone who's curious in what's going on behind the scenes here, what I'm doing is I'm saying take the period before the dashed line, before the significant event happened, and actually put a very faint white rectangle over the top of that, which is effectively making everything look slightly faded. So I'm not just saying here's when the key thing happened. I'm emphasizing, really drawing attention to the thing we care about, which is what happened, that explosion in the number of records in the couple of years since then. So that's one example again of how annotation can be about more than text. It's text, but it's also just leaning into anything we can do to really emphasize the part of the chart, the part of the data, the part of the story that is most significant. If I now go into the next one, I'm going to talk again about the ability to freely annotate and just to put text wherever we want it. This is essentially a way of using labels and annotations on our charts to tell a story. So this, I'm afraid, is veering back into US politics territory, but hopefully is an interesting one for us to all think about. So this was a chart where I'm taking data from almost 70 years of data here on what Americans associate the Democratic Party with, things they like about the Democratic Party. And we've got whether people saying they like them because they represent the working class, because they're good on healthcare, climate change, they stand up for the marginalized, all those things. And this is a classic case where there's nothing technically wrong with this chart, but I think we can do better. We can make the story clearer. We can make this something for people to read as a story instead of to pass as a chart. So to show you what I mean by this, or you might remember in last week's session I talked about this sort of Z pattern when someone looks at a chart. We know from eye tracking software, people read across the title, they then come to the left, and then they read down diagonally across the chart. So how can we have the design of our chart really lean into that? Well, I'm going to come across to my live demos again, and let's see if I can remember how this one works. Right. What I want to do is have the labels for each of these lines positioned in a way that naturally follows the eye instead of all being clumped together at the end there, where you've got to check back and forth about which one refers to which line. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, actually, let's only show a couple of these lines as labels at the end of the line. And the rest we're going to reposition. So sorry, I'm just going to refresh the page. I'm going to come in and say, only place the climate change, and if I can remember what it was called, they're good on healthcare. Only place those two labels at the end of the lines, whereas the other two labels I'm going to put in a more narratively useful place. So if I just copy and paste these other two label names, I'm going to go into story mode. I'm going to again remove our navigation, because what we want to be doing here is just annotating rather than a step through. And then I'm going to come in here and I'm going to say, right, let's actually put the labels in a place where they will be read as if they're chapters in a story. So again, I'm going to come down here. I'm going to say, let's center align this label right in this position where the eye will immediately fall on this and see that this is what the Democratic Party used to be known for. And we can again make that text slightly darker in the background. And then I'm going to come over here, and for this one, emphasize that people now are more likely to associate the Democrats with standing up for marginalized groups. And again, I will just take the color of that line from the eyedropper and darken it slightly to show up more. So we've gone, if I just go back to the original, and I'll do that in a second, we've gone from this being a technically correct chart, but one where if I go back a second, we've gone from it being a technically correct chart, but one where it's quite dry, all the labels are clustered together, to this version, sorry, where you're reading across this as a story. We're seeing, right, they used to be associated mainly with the representing the working class. And we read across the line that has shot up, the thing that people now come to associate the Democrats with more is that they stand up for marginalized groups. And then here are these other two categories, which are secondary to those. So small changes, but turning this from a chart for chart people into a chart which really can be read as a story in order, in sequence like that. And we're now going to do, for the final section, a real focus on using color. We've done a lot there on text, but what about color? So first things first, I'm going to take an example here, which I teased last week, but I think is just a really nice example to show how we can use color to direct attention. So here is some data on the number of people killed in road accidents in various developed countries. Plotted it using default colors, nice bright colors, but what are we actually trying to say here? This again is where we should write the title for our chart first to tell us what we're trying to say, and then design the chart to meet that title. So what do we want to say here? We want to be talking about the fact that the US has significantly higher rates of road deaths than other countries. That's what we can see from the data and from the chart here, but we need to emphasize it better. So first we write our title. We can now keep referring back to that title and seeing, does our chart tell this story? So straight away, we can knock back the colors of the countries that are secondary to this, but emphasize the US. Now this chart much more intuitively, much more powerfully tells that story without someone having to dig around in the data as much as possible. We can also, because this is using a tool like Flourish, any interactive tool, someone could still hover over those lines to see the data for each country instead of them all being lost in a massive gray. So we're simultaneously emphasizing the key point, but allowing someone to see more. Again, we can then use annotation to tell the reader other interesting things. So here I can say another notable thing in the US isn't just that their death rates are higher, it's that they actually rose significantly higher still during the pandemic as part of a wider rise in disorder in the US. But another little pro tip at this point, you always want annotations, I think, to be supportive information, secondary information rather than primary. You don't want them to be grabbing too much of the attention. So in this instance, we want the main focus just to be on the US line being higher, and we want the annotation to be secondary. And so what we can do for that is a very subtle change. We just make the text of that annotation slightly more faded, slightly less bold and black. So it's now someone comes to this chart, they see the key thing, which is the US line being significantly different to the rest. And then the annotation is there as a secondary piece of information. But that's not the only way we can use color. Directing attention is the classic that makes the message as clear as possible, but we can also use color as data. And so the example I'm going to use for that is another one from a couple of years ago where I wanted to show what's happened to rates of housing construction and house prices in different parts of the US. Now, here again is what would happen if we threw that data straight into a chart using default color palettes. We get all these lovely bright colors. It's very visually engaging, but is this telling the story that we're trying to tell? So in the title, we're talking about how Texan cities, so cities in the US state of Texas, have built more homes than those in California, and their housing has therefore been much affordable. But so there's a lot of work the reader has to do looking at this chart to actually pull that out of it. You've got to have an instinctive knowledge of which US cities are in Texas and which are California. Now, if you're American, that might be easy, but if you're not, it might not. B, you've then got to pick out which lines are which color, which colors make up the Texan states and which make up the Californian cities, sorry. So what we can instead do is lean into that previously mentioned association of red with Republicans, blue with Democrats, Republicans generally faring better in Texas, Democrats in California. Same data, but we're now tweaking the colors. And now this chart is really telling our story. It's emphasizing that in these red states, cities in the red states have built more houses and have seen a significantly smaller increase in house prices. Cities in California have built much less housing and have seen a much bigger rise in house prices. So we're using the colors here, not just to tell you which are in Texas and which are California, but to emphasize that when something is high over here, it's low over there. When something is low over here, it's high over there. So we're actually telling the story using color as well. And the last little touch that we've got going on here is what I've done is I've bolded up the most salient cities, the cities that people are most likely to have heard of, particularly related to housing. So San Francisco is really the poster child of a city that builds nowhere near enough housing and has exceptionally high house prices, sorry, whereas Austin and Houston have both been in the news recently for building a lot of housing and for seeing prices and rents fall significantly. So the other city names are in there as the sort of contextual information, but we're emphasizing the most salient ones. And then another example of what we can do with color is when we don't just care about the lines in a chart, for example, we don't just care about the main series, but the gap between those lines, the gap between some data points is actually really important. So this is a chart that I first made a year and a bit ago. This was a piece I wrote about the growing political gender divide in how young men and young women vote. And what I'm going to show you first is the version of the chart that I didn't end up publishing. And I'm then going to talk about why and why I ended up doing the version that I did. So here I've got data on the liberal or left-wing vote among young men and young women, and I'm plotting the gap between the two. And what we're seeing here is that there used to be very little gap between how young men in their 20s and women in their 20s voted in countries including South Korea, the US, Germany, and the UK. That gap used to be zero. That gap has since exploded to above 40 points in Korea, more than 30 in the US, 30 in Germany, more than 20 in the UK. That's a gap with young women being significantly more left-wing or liberal. Now, this again, the data is all solid. The chart is technically correct, but I think, and we'll see in a minute, I think this is just it's too abstract. We're showing by showing the gap and not actually showing what's happening to young men, young women. We're we're creating distance essentially between people out there in the world and the data. So what we really want to do when we're talking about a gap and we're talking about young men and we're talking about young women is to have all of those things in the chart, not just a gap. So the version in this slide, which is the one that I ended up publishing, again, that shows exactly the same data, but whereas this one, I'm just plotting the gap. This time I'm plotting what's happened to young women, what's happened to young men, and highlighting the gap. So this is a chart that I think, and I think the evidence from the response of this story would support this. It speaks to a lot more people. People can now see much more viscerally. We're seeing a gap opening up. We're seeing young women move this way, young men move that way. You can see the nuances of in Korea, it's mainly about young men shifting sharply to the right. In other countries, a lot of this is also about young women shifting to the left. So we're showing more. We still have the gap. And by putting those dots on the end of the line as well, we're emphasizing drawing the eye to the end of the lines where the gap is the widest. So same data, but by mixing it differently, by really elevating the human aspect of this instead of this much more abstract data over here, I think we have a much more powerful chart. Sorry about that ping. And I will now show you the final example from today, which is how we can actually use color as a critical part of the story of the narrative. So I'm going to show you a before and after here of a chart where all I'm doing is tweaking the color involved in the chart, but you'll see that it significantly enhances, enriches, and indeed changes the story being told. So this is a chart showing what has happened to UK government spending, public spending, investment in various different measures, how that compares to other rich countries in the West, and what has happened to that over the last 30 or so years. So we're seeing that in terms of total government spending, the UK spends significantly less than most peer countries. It rose for a while, but then fell. Government spending on healthcare, the UK is again below average. In terms of capital investment, has fallen below average. And in terms of buying machinery and capital in healthcare, there's been this really deep drop recently to now be well below peer countries. So this chart is already interesting. It's telling us something about the rise and the fall and the fact that the UK invests a lot less than countries we might consider our peers. But we can make one subtle change, and this chart tells a much richer story. So what I've done here is I've colored each line according to which political party was in charge in the UK when this was all happening. So what we see now is that everything shown in the previous slide was true, but what's been happening behind the scenes is that during times when the Labour government was in charge, there was a significant increase in government spending, more public spending on health, on investment, on all these things. But then during periods of Conservative control, that funding was then cut again, famously in the 2010s from austerity. So just flip between those two again. Exactly the same data, exactly the same chart type. Everything's the same, except this time we're again using color to add context and tell a much richer story. So that brings us through this peek behind the scenes of how we do things at the FT. Just to reiterate the key points, always start by writing that chart title to remind yourself or help yourself figure out what it is that you're trying to show. Then let the function of that title, what have you said you're trying to do, let that guide the design decisions you then make. And remember that it can often be very, very small changes, whether that's one annotation or one slight change in the color of a line, which can have big impacts. So now I'm going to hand over back to Mafe to see if we have time for a couple of questions.
Hi, John. Thank you so much. That was an amazing session. And yes, we do have heaps of questions. I'm actually going to go over a couple very quickly, just in the interest of time. But again, amazing, lovely to see all those examples. So maybe starting with the latest chart. Some people are asking, how did you manage to A, shade between all the gray lines, but at the same time highlighting that specific line and the split color?
Cool, yeah. So we've got the ability to, on a line chart, to shade between a couple of lines. So what I did here was I generated two lines as well as the lines for individual countries. I've got a line in there which was the minimum of every year, and one was the maximum of every year. And so I'm then just saying, right, shade that between those two lines in a light gray. And then to change the colors of the lines, you've had to slightly reshape the data there. So instead of just having one column here with UK, I've created three columns. One is what I've called conservative one, then Labour, then conservative two. So you've got three separate lines there in taking up different rows of a data sheet. And then I've gone into annotation mode to label those lines.
Amazing. Great hacks over there. Or should I say tricks? Then again, keeping up on this one because it's a grid of charts, people were asking how many charts do you think readers can take at once? And I think it's a good one because obviously there's a lot going on here, even if you're only highlighting trends and patterns. But is there a hard number? Do you think that that's a thing?
It's a fantastic question. I think I try what I try to do is have all the most important information visible in one screen. And I
Mm,
say because on desktop it might look like this, where you've got four charts across. On mobile, maybe that grid is two by two. But I
mhm,
think because of the timeline we live in, where people screenshot things and share them to one another, I think it's just good practice to try and have everything visible in all at once on one screen. So that's because it allows someone to screenshot and share. But also, if you've got a legend somewhere, and imagine if you've got a stack of, let's say, 10 of these little charts, by the
mhm,
time someone scrolled halfway down, the legend might not even be visible anymore. So they might have to scroll back up to think, hang on, what was, I mean, not in this example, but like what was yellow, what was red, what was orange. So I think having everything visible on one screen is good practice. Again, not essential. Sometimes there's just too much information to show that is important and you have to break out of that. But that's the
mhm.
general practice I go for.
Amazing. Great segue there because we also got a question around mobile and responsiveness, and I know we haven't touched on that, but do you have any tips or any sort of like rules of thumb on how to make sure the charts work well for desktop and mobile?
Yeah, so where possible, I mean, maybe this is too much. Like at the FT, we always make two charts for every chart. So you'll see a mobile specific one on mobile and a desktop specific one on desktop. That allows us to play around with the order that we're showing the data in, font sizes. Maybe we even have more annotations on desktop than mobile, that kind of thing. But I think general best practice is design for mobile.
Mm,
Designed for mobile, and then it'll be good enough for desktop as is. So I don't know about it, this will vary for different organizations, but the vast majority of people online at any given time now are using their mobile phone rather than desktop. Think about office hours versus out of the office. People just getting home and turning on the PC or even the laptop these days is much rarer than it used to be. So for us at the FT, it's about 75% of our traffic is mobile. So
mhm,
we, well, when I'm making a chart, I'm always thinking, make sure I've got the mobile version nailed. And then I will think, right, do I want to add anything to the desktop one? Do I want to use the fact that I've got more space to play with? Maybe I have more annotations, that kind of thing. But
mhm,
always get the mobile one right first.
That's a great tip, actually. We got a lot of questions around color, so maybe an easy one first. On the super shoe chart, you split gender with a light blue and then a darker blue. Is there a reason behind that, or would you have done maybe like a different color choice, like perhaps two contrasting colors or just two different colors altogether?
No particular reason. That was just what I went with for this one. But there is an interesting jumping off point there about color and sex. So, there's the sort of, if you went back 30 years, any chart about men and women, the men would have been blue, the women in pink, or something like that. And it's actually an interesting one. I don't think this is necessarily as simple as saying, well, that's sort of patronizing, like women and girls are pink. That's 100% true, but it's also just the way a lot of people would expect to see the data, which isn't means that I don't think that's necessarily wrong. But at the FT, when we're showing data for men and women, male and female, we definitely don't use blue and pink, and we would try to use different color combinations. Blue and red could work, for example, or just any two colors that are different. In this instance, I kind of wanted the chart to look like an overall explosion rather than the sort of two separate explosions, let's say one in orange and one in green. So
Mhm,
what the only reason I chose two shades of blue here is that the fact that the data is broken up by gender is kind of incidental, by sex, sorry. So what I'm doing here is just saying you've had this big explosion in all performances. Now I happen to be able to split that by sex, but what I want to show overall is that sort of explosion to both sides.
That's a great point. Like similar shades for similar topic, I guess. Somebody did flag in the chat that people are doing more purple and green, and obviously your gap chart also was teal and orange, I think. So obviously different colors for different topics. Maybe we have chance for one last question, and it's around accessibility. So a couple of people asked a question about how you balance color and meeting the accessibility requires of an organization, and what to do when you have a limited color palette.
Yeah, look, I mean, we could talk for an hour about accessibility, and I say that as a good thing. I think the fact that we're talking about this more and more is excellent. Um, Limited color palettes, it's just a tricky one. I think I'm talked to you for 2 hours now about the importance of color and being able to choose which color works best for different situations. And if you're really constrained by a corporate color palette, that is challenging. I guess what I would do in that situation is try and plead for the ability to have a separate charting palette within your,
Mhm,
like, let's say, for example, an organization had a palette which was just say 3 shades of blue or something like that. Maybe you say, right, look, we'll always have maybe the logo or something on the chart. We'll always use our core colors, and we will always try to use those colors wherever possible in our charts. But if I'm making a chart with 3 lines in it, and it makes sense to have them in blue and red and green instead of 3 shades of blue, then try and argue for having a separate sort of data viz palette like that. That's, I guess, good luck to see if that works. But yeah, generally, again, accessibility is something we think about massively. So in the chart I've got on screen right now, for example, what I'm doing is I'm saying, right, make sure the most important lines in the chart are strong colors which contrast both from each other and from the background. The paler colors, the text obviously saying things like Dallas and San Antonio here would not pass accessibility, but that's deliberate. That's a choice saying that is secondary information, which is not critical for someone to be able to read. And I think that is the point I would emphasize here is that accessibility is it's a much more it's about thinking about this holistically. Like, what are we trying to do here? Have we made sure that the critical information can be read? If someone is less able to see parts of the chart, that is not a failing of accessibility. It's just a decision about what matters, what doesn't. So if I go very quickly back to this chart, all of these lines in the background are gray. Now, again, with the ability to interact and hover, you can see the data under them. But this,
mhm,
again, is not an accessibility failing. It is
mm,
the designer, me, whoever, saying, what matters about this chart is that you can see Labour, you can see Conservative, and you can see other. So I think I would just say whenever we're thinking about accessibility, it doesn't mean every single element on your chart has to pass contrast with every other element. It means that key elements of your chart have to be as clear as possible, should pass accessibility. But if you have secondary elements, that is a secondary consideration.
mhm. Amazing.
Final
I think we
point
can talk about,
is that we
yeah.
have alt text on all of the charts we publish as well, which Flourish provides the ability for as well.